Hi, my name is Jackie. I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when I was 8. I play hard because that's how I do everything. I always push myself to be the best that I can be. Type 1 diabetes does not stop me from doing the things that I like to do.
Hello and welcome to Teen 1D, the podcast for teenagers and young adults living with type 1 diabetes. The podcast is not intended as a substitute for professional medicine advice or treatment. My guest for you today is Professor Matthew Weber. Matthew Weber is an associate professor in the Department of Chemical and Biomedical Engineering at the University of Notre Dame. He graduated from the University of Notre Dame with a Bachelor in Science in Chemical Engineering, earned both a Master of Science PhD in Biomedical Engineering from Northwestern University, and completed an NIH and RSA postdoctoral fellowship at the Koch Institute at MIT before returning to the University of Notre Dame to start his independent research group. Hi, Professor Weber. Welcome to the Teen 1D podcast. Most of my listeners are teenagers and young adults who have type 1 diabetes. Many of them are thinking about their next steps, including courses in high school, majors of fields they'd like to study in college, and graduate school and career opportunities. So to begin, can you share with us where you're from and how you ended up choosing to attend the University of Notre Dame for your undergrad degree?
Yeah, sure. Happy to be here and enjoy talking to your audience a little bit about our research. So I am originally from Salt Lake City, Utah, and at some point decided I wanted to leave Utah and try, going to college outside of the state. And so applied to a few places and ended up at the University of Notre Dame.
When did you know that you wanted to study chemical engineering?
So I came into undergraduate as a biochemistry major with the idea that I wanted to go to medical school. And at some point, pretty quickly thereafter, realized that I didn't want to do school anymore, that I was kind of done with school, had a lot of student loans, had other sorts of things, and thought it was, would be a good idea to kind of get a major that I thought I could really get, a good job with straight out of undergraduate. Of course, plans later changed. I ended up going to graduate school, and then beyond that, did a postdoctoral fellowship. And so though I thought originally, I'd switch to chemical engineering so I could get a job straight out of undergrad, it took me about 9 years to really get my first job after finishing my degree. So things definitely changed a bit.
So what is it about teaching that made you want to become a college professor?
So actually, I wasn't necessarily initially drawn to the idea of the teaching portion of the job. I was really passionate about launching my own research group, and teaching was something originally that I kind of thought, this kind of comes along with the kind of cost of having your own research group and running a research group in a university setting, which was the part of the job that I was most passionate about initially. And then the funny thing is, coming here and beginning teaching, really kind of found that I enjoyed it a lot. And so that was sort of a happy surprise, right? It was the part of the job that I wasn't so sure about initially. And it's the part of the job that actually I really get kind of energized and excited about now for sure, because it's a lot of fun to work with students. I'm very fortunate to enjoy teaching a lot more than I thought I might.
Yeah. How did you become involved in research involving type 1 diabetes?
So I did my PhD at Northwestern, and I was developing new materials and therapeutic devices for cardiovascular. I was interested, like I said, in going to do a postdoctoral fellowship, and wanted to work in the lab of Bob Langer at MIT. And part of the reason I wanted to work for Bob is he'd been very prolific in terms of academic to translational industrial kind of applications of his research. And so Bob is one of, if not the most prolific academic inventors in the history of the world. He started, on the order of about 40 successful companies, had, thousands of patents, many of which have been licensed and turned into products. His recent claim to fame is he's one of the founders of Moderna, which of course we're all now very thankful for the COVID vaccines. And so I wanted to go to MIT to work with Bob. At the time when I was going there, I was presented with the option of working with Bob and another faculty member at MIT, Dan Anderson, on a project they'd recently gotten funded to do glucose-responsive insulin therapeutics. And so up until that point in my life, I'd never really thought about research in the area of diabetes. But it seemed like a good opportunity to go there and specifically to go and work in the Langer lab and work with Bob and Dan and try to develop some new technologies. And so it wasn't like I had some sort of personal narrative that called me into the diabetes space. I didn't really know anybody close to me with type 1 diabetes growing up or anything like that. It was more just an opportunity to go and do research at a place that I wanted to go work with a mentor that I wanted to go work for. And this was sort of what was on offer. And so I accepted it.
So because you didn't know anyone, how did you and your team envision this creative use of glucagon? When you were first discussing the hydrogels, Did you realize that these might save lives and allow the parents of people with type 1 to sleep at night? Or had this not even occurred to you?
We definitely had some thoughts about it. And so, like I said, I spent, 4.5 years or so at MIT working in the area of glucose responsive insulin. And so I knew sort of that side of things, how you could make materials or modified insulins or things that would be responsive to high glucose and respond in order to increase the activity of the insulin or make insulin available. And so then when I was coming here, I started thinking about maybe reverse engineering a lot of those systems and making those systems respond to low glucose instead. And so kind of thinking about glucagon began in a few places, one of which was discussions with one of the agencies that presently funds some of my research and learning about their evolving interest in glucose responsive glucagon. But getting a little bit more into it was, I had dinner one night with a faculty member who was visiting Notre Dame to give a seminar. And she had a type 1 diabetic child at that point, probably aged about 11 or 12. And she was telling me about how hard evenings were for her and the nights were for her and her husband, where, they hadn't slept at the same time in like 3 years since her daughter's diagnosis. One was they were sleeping in shifts, one at a time, and the other one was kind of up and watching and making sure that the daughter didn't have any sudden lows. And so I was kind of thinking about this and could we develop technologies that might prevent some of these sudden drops in blood glucose from happening overnight using some of what we knew about making glucose responsive insulins and just kind of changing the paradigm a little bit. So certainly it was something we knew what we were going for going in. We knew the type of impact it might have. The first grant I wrote on this idea, I spoke about the health complications of parents who have to care for young children, the increased risks of depression and cardiovascular disease, and there's the rates of divorce and things like this in parents with young diabetic children are higher, and there's a lot of stress that it puts on the family. It puts people under a lot of physical, a lot of mental, a lot of emotional stress. And so these were things that I'd been reading a lot about, but this sort of was nucleated by this conversation with a colleague who was going through this at the time.
And just for our audience who may not know exactly what the hydrogel does, could you provide an explanation on that?
Yeah, so we have a few different flavors of this. So I think what you're speaking about now is we had a recent paper that comes out that just came out that is on a gel material. So you could think about this as, like Jell-O, right? Has that sort of consistency. But if you look in, you zoom in really close, these are nanoscale fibers that make sort of a basket or a mesh type structure, right? And so what this is able to do is within that sort of basket or that mesh, we can hold glucagon, and we make the material such that if there is not very much glucose around, that mesh dissolves to release the entrapped glucagon that's kind of stuck in the net or the mesh-like structure. And so the general idea with the material is it's very easy to push through a syringe. So you could imagine sort of a gel type material that would be in, say, a pen injector, for instance. You would inject this the way you would inject insulin or some other therapeutic. And the gel would sort of hold glucagon in place, provided blood glucose was at a normal or high level. But if it got low, the gel would dissolve and in doing so release glucagon that would be encapsulated within.
So a couple of years ago, I would have been going into my freshman year of high school. I was away at a diabetes camp and I had a seizure in the middle of the night while I was there. And if I had taken the hydrogel before bed, the seizure was because my blood sugar was low. Would it have been possible to prevent that? Or is that something that has yet to be tested?
So we've done an animal model kind of modeling the condition you speak of. And so that data was published in our recent publication as well. These are in mice. And so I'd caution you just to know that, this is things that are still a ways off. And we realize that our first technology in this area is imperfect in a lot of ways. And we have new iterations of this technology where we're working on trying to improve things. But the general idea would be, you could have a material that, before bed that night, before you'd had this seizure at your summer camp, you could have had an injection of this that would have had glucagon ready for you in the event that you did have a low episode. That would be the idea. Now, is our current technology going to be the winner in that regard? Is this going to be the thing that people are injecting, 10, 15 years down the road? I don't think so. I think that we have challenges with this current technology. One of which is, it's a little bit too slow to react. It leaks a little bit too much when you don't need glucagon. There's some things that we'd like to fix, but the general idea is that, yes, that we would have, that kind of technology. And so in the paper, we'd done an animal model modeling that exact scenario where we had diabetic mice and we'd given them a long-acting detamir, which is kind of a basal insulin to keep them sort of on a normal glucose level. And then we gave them the gel sometime following that. And so they had this gel under their skin. And then a couple hours after we'd given them the gel, we gave them an insulin overdose. And so we gave them a shot of insulin to basically overdose them on insulin. And we monitored the extent to which their blood glucose dropped was one of the things we monitored, and then how fast it bounced back. And so the mice that had been treated before overdose, so 2 hours before they were even overdosed with insulin with our gel, didn't get as hypoglycemic. They bounced back quicker, and wasn't necessarily a primary endpoint of the study. But it just so happens that in the control groups, a couple of mice died. In our treatment groups, none of the mice died, and so they didn't get hypo enough to actually have a lethal response. And so that was encouraging. But like I said, we know this technology isn't perfect yet, and so we're thinking about ways to make it better for sure.
I know that you are still in the early stages of development of the hydrogels, but how much time passes between the release of the hydrogel into your system and the release of the glucagon afterwards?
So it's pretty fast acting, I think. Glucagon is a very fast acting therapeutic molecule. It typically, if you just inject glucagon, for instance, you could expect your blood glucose to spike up within about 10 to 15 minutes. And then, 30 or 40 minutes later, it's kind of already coming back down. And so it's a pretty fast acting molecule. And so the limiting step is really the material doing the transformation from, encased to open. And so I think once it does that, once the glucagon is out and hitting circulation, it acts pretty quick.
I was just curious about that part. Do you know if it's any faster than the glucagon shot or if there's any time difference there?
It's probably slower only because the material is in the way. Okay. Versus the glucagon shot, it's ready to go, right? You've suspended it, it's ready to go. You can give the emergency shot. Our technology for now is slower, but the good news would be that it'd be more autonomous, right? So you don't need to give yourself a shot or have someone there to be able to give you a shot if you needed it. It would be ready to go for you and kind of acting without your, kind of immediate involvement.
So another question that I have is what happens to the hydrogel and the glucagon on a night where the glucagon is unnecessary?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that's something we've gotten a lot of questions about. The truth is that it's going to just slowly release glucagon over time, over a period of probably a few days, if it didn't ever have like the low glucose event to really trigger a burst. And so it's going to slowly release glucagon over a few days. The material is going to be slowly degraded and cleared over days to about a week. We can't find these gels a week after we inject them. And so if they go somewhere, they probably are just slowly kind of falling apart and degrading. And so you would have a little bit of glucagon around at all times that might be slowly releasing from the gel. I think the good news is that doesn't seem to be too much of a problem. So it doesn't seem like there's a big problem associated with too much glucagon around. Glucagon is a molecule that our bodies see all the time, even in a type 1 state. Though glucagon signaling is a little dysfunctional, it's still, something that's around all the time in different levels. And so a little bit more or less probably isn't a huge issue.
Okay. And then is the glucagon dosage in the hydrogel similar to that of the nose spray and the emergency kit, or is there a different amount in the hydrogel?
So I think that's something we don't know what it would look like in the human form. If you took the dose we give mice and you multiplied by the difference in size between a mouse and a human, it's probably like, probably 100 to 1,000 times more. I don't remember the exact math, but that's just because we can only put so little in a gel and have it stay in. And so the mice get a kind of a supercharged dose of it, but that's something that could be tunable. The other challenge is, you wouldn't want to inject something more than about, a couple hundred microliters in a human, and it's nearly impossible to inject less than about 50 microliters in a mouse just because syringes are only so small. And so you can't really scale all these things precisely between mouse and human, but it'd be on the order similar. I think one of the things we're encouraged by is there's some clinical data out there of microdosing of glucagon. And so you can find examples where, you get a lot of the same effect with about 1/10 of the dose in one of those emergency kits. So it doesn't seem like you need I think those emergency kits have 1 milligram of glucagon in them. And they have studies where people get 0.1 milligrams and they get most of the same effect. And so I think there's a reasonable window to play with. And certainly we could overshoot that and give 2 or 3 milligrams and it probably wouldn't be too much of a problem either.
Yeah. Also, while doing research for this interview, I read that your research project is funded by both the ADA and JDRF. So to receive funding for that, how did you go about that?
Yeah, so I should mention it's funded also by, and one of the key players in this is the Helmsley Charitable Trust as well. And so the 3 of them fund our research. And so, I mean, this gets a little bit to my life and my job and what I do. And so I run a research group at Notre Dame, and my research group right now is 10 PhD students and then 4 people with PhDs who are doing a postdoctoral fellowship with me. So those 14 people work for me full time and I pay their salaries. I pay for all of their research expenses, all of their consumables, their chemicals, their reagents. We pay for all the mice. We do all that. Right. And so the bills add up, I mean, it adds up to, on the order of $1 million or so a year, plus or minus a little bit to run a team that size. And so the way we do that is we write grants to funding agencies and foundations. And so I write, or up until recently, was writing a lot of external grants. And so the way this would work for the diabetes work is I would propose an idea to one of those funding bodies you mentioned, JDRF or ADA or Helmsley. I'd propose an idea to them, and then they would review it and they would see how this idea slotted within their priorities for what they want to work on, how it aligns with their budget, right? So they have a fixed, and finite and unfortunately not large enough budget in a lot of cases. And so they have to make hard choices over what they fund and what they don't fund. And so you'll find that a lot of these grants have, 10% success rate, 15% success rate or worse. So what that means for my end is you have to write a lot of proposals, you have to make a lot of connections, you have to build a lot of network. And what it means for people like JDRF and ADA and some of them that depend on donors, they're out there trying to raise money from donations and from sponsorships in order to be able to fund as much research as they can.
Yeah, I definitely not heard about it from that angle before. I think that's very interesting. So along the same lines, what is it like to be an associate professor at the same school where you attended college?
Yeah, it's been interesting. I can't say, I left Notre Dame in 2006 when I finished my bachelor's degree. And I was gone for 10 years. As I mentioned, I went to Northwestern and then to MIT. And then I was recruited back in large part because they built this brand new building that is virtually behind me. And, there was all these new resources available for the brand of research that I like to do. And so I was recruited back, and I can't say when I left in 2006 that I said to myself, oh, I'd do anything to come back to Notre Dame. It was exactly the opposite. In my mind, I was thinking, I did Notre Dame. I was there. I finished that, and then let's go see what else I can do. And so I was a little bit surprised by how much had changed when I came back to interview here in 2016. In 10 years, all the new facilities, all the new resources and everything. And so that was really kind of a pleasant surprise for me was, all the great things that had been built in that 10 years that I was gone. And so it was kind of not something I ever planned on, but it worked out pretty well. And it's been great. I think I'm able to interact with, especially the undergraduates, in a way that a lot of my colleagues aren't, just because I was them. It was a long time ago now, but I was them at some point. I was living in the same dorms and taking the same classes. And, in a lot of cases, I had the same faculty that they have teaching a lot of their courses. And so I think I'm able to relate to them in a way that might be uncommon for faculty. And so that's kind of interesting. It's been good. And, I came in with big ideas and kind of a bold vision for something I wanted to build. And, I think I'd be most proud to really kind of build that at a place that I, like a lot. And so if I could build something really big and bold and kind of transformational at Notre Dame, I think that'd be better than building it at, pick your average flagship state school, in the Midwest, right? I feel like I'd feel more proud. I would feel like I'd kind of accomplish more. And I feel like the university might appreciate me a bit more if I could really come and build something new and unique here. And so, so it's been good so far.
Thank you. And do you have any advice for anyone looking to choose a major right now, or any people who are interested in your fields of expertise in the sciences?
Yeah, so I think, I'm obviously biased. I think, chemical engineering is the best major, somebody can get if you're interested in science and math and these kinds of things. Because you can do a lot. You can do all the bio stuff. You can do all the chemistry stuff. You can do, practical applications of these things to make products and make things that people can actually use. And so I'm pretty biased in that regard as far as like what I think is the best, major for an undergraduate to get. But, apart from my own biases, I guess my advice would be, I think that, people, and maybe in your age or your generation, finishing high school, going to college, and I was probably the same myself. There's a tendency to think that things that happen are overly consequential, right? That where you go to college is going to change the course of your life, or what you study is going to change the course of your life. And I think that when you get older, you kind of realize that you have a lot of freedom, and you can try things and you can make mistakes. Right? You can decide you don't like something and you can change your mind and you can try something different. And you have a lot of freedom to do that at that age that you don't have later in life. You get a little older and you start having people that depend on you, and you start having, financial commitments, or you have things like families and mortgages and, other sorts of things. And you don't have as much freedom to sort of try something new. And so my advice would be, explore broadly, figure out what you're interested in, and don't be afraid to try something new, and don't be afraid to not like it and change your mind or try something else, right? I think that you have a lot of freedom at your age to do things that certainly is enviable when you get to a point where you don't get to maybe just drop what you're doing and try something totally new, right? I don't think my wife would be particularly pleased if I just told her I was quitting my job and going back to school to try something else. I think that would probably be a long and hard conversation, right? And that's freedom I had at some point in my life and don't anymore. And so I would embrace the uncertainty of maybe not knowing what you want to do with your life, and use that as an opportunity to explore new things.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, and I'm happy to be here. It's fantastic to meet you, and really appreciate what you're doing. I think this is something I'm passionate about. A few things. One of them is sort of scientific and public outreach. One of them is education, particularly as it relates to diabetes and diabetes research. And so I do a lot of speaking and meetings and things like that with the JDRF and ADA and other sorts of people that like have an interest in this stuff. And so this is right up my alley. This is perfect, to be able to talk about science to an audience, and then also, speak about the things that I think are going to be, exciting or helpful coming down the pipe for diabetes and possibly, hopefully, new therapeutics in the not too distant future. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's all for today. If you have any suggestions for future topics or guests, or just want to say hi, don't hesitate to reach out. You can email me at teen.teen1d@gmail.com or DM me on Instagram at teen1dpodcast with no spaces or capital letters. If you like my podcast, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review, as it really does help me out. Thank you so much for listening, and don't forget to tune into next week's episode. Have a great week. Bye.